Really appreciate this opportunity to talk to Andy today. And Andy, first and foremost, I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation with you. I think this idea of leveraging the federal programs that are now going to be available with the CHIPS Act and with the Inflation Reduction Act has tremendous potential for the state of Oregon. So not only could we expand the development of clean energy technologies, but it could have a tremendously positive impact on the overall health of our economy. So some really great potential outcomes. So I'm really, pleased to be here, but more importantly, I want to learn a little bit about what you're working on around these initiatives. So the last time you and I worked together was in 2018. And at that point, you were consulting on the merger of the two prominent business associations in Oregon, OBA and AOI, which ultimately became Oregon Business and Industry, or OBI, which is one of the sponsors today, so that's really great. But I also heard recently that you joined Portland General Electric. So what is it that brought you there?
Well, thanks for doing this with me, Karen. So I guess that was, almost 5 years ago. So that was really fun work to bring those two business associations together. But really, my background has been more in energy. And I spent a lot of time consulting with Bonneville Power, learning the bulk electric system, and then PGE became a client of mine in about 2015. And in 2018, when Maria Pope took over as a CEO at PGE, I knew enough about the company to know that they were really pivoting their strategy to decarbonization. And for somebody who is an engineer by background, but really likes kind of how systems come together, who could, I think, see where the energy industry is going, PGE seemed like a pretty natural place. And so in 2018, I made that jump and really jumped into a role focused on customer programs and technologies there.
So as I understand it, you're in a newly created role now at Portland General, Director, Regional Business Initiatives. So what does that actually mean, Andy?
That's a good question. My wife asked me the same question, and I sort of struggled to answer it. But yeah, it is a newly created role, and I think the role really came out of the recognition that we do have this, what we would call a generational opportunity with the CHIPS Act and the IRA and the IIJA to capture investment on behalf of Oregon. And so, I think it was, sometime earlier this year when the semiconductor task force was formed and Maria co-chaired that, that group really kind of came together and looked at, what is the opportunity within the CHIPS Act. They developed a set of priorities, a set of recommendations for the state. And now that we're sort of shifting gears out of recommendation mode and really honestly looking down the pipe here at implementation mode, I think PGE recognized they really needed somebody to sort of jump in with the region and make sure that we're being a good partner as this all kind of comes to fruition.
So what does that actually mean for Portland General Electric?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. So maybe I should even take a step back. I mean, PGE is on this, I don't know, if you followed the news last summer, House Bill 2021 was this sort of groundbreaking legislation that we worked on with partners, with the legislators, and it really took, our clean energy goals from, 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050, pulled them forward by 20 years to make those by 2030. So 80% reduction by 2030 and zero emissions in our energy supply by 2040. And so, when we look at what's it going to take for PGE to get there, what kind of investments will we need to make, what kind of workforce will we need to make, what sort of technologies will we need to leverage in order to really make 2030 and 2040 a reality. Things like the CHIPS Act and having the high-tech manufacturing ecosystem here, the research and development ecosystem, the workforce and higher ed ecosystem here is actually really critical to us to be able to execute on those targets.
So you mentioned the CHIPS Act, and I know it's a really important part of your new focus. just for everyone in the audience's understanding, you might want to give kind of a high-level overview of it.
Sure. So the CHIPS Act is a little different. Probably everybody's heard a little bit about like the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Inflation Reduction Act. Those were really focused on infrastructure and on accelerating our progress as a country towards some different clean energy goals and different outcomes. The CHIPS Act was sort of created a little bit differently than that. So it's really focused on U.S. competitiveness around chip manufacturing, R&D, the things that go into chips. And if you've tried to buy a car or maybe even a new computer or dishwasher over the last 18 or 24 months, you might have seen kind of the supply chain slowdown around chips and how important those are. I think I read recently that a new vehicle has something like 30 to 70 chips, depending on the car, embedded in that vehicle. And so I think what's happening with the CHIPS Act is the federal government and the semiconductor industry are recognizing that that we've sort of lost an advantage globally, and that it has become not just an economic advantage or an economic question, but one that even sort of starts to infringe on things like national security. And so the administration and Congress implemented the CHIPS Act. It's about $280 billion worth of investment in this industry. About 200 of that is really focused on, I think, research and development. But there's about 57, if I'm getting my numbers right, that is focused on manufacturing and bringing sort of chips to fruition. And that's, all of those dollars we think are, at play for Oregon. But the task force was created really to recognize the fact that it's not a guarantee and that we need to be competitive in order to get Oregon's share of that.
Well, you mentioned all of the net zero goals and the ESG goals that so many companies have. And I think this idea of onshoring is a major component of that. So it sounds like that's really a large part of that focus for PGE. I think it's 95% of publicly traded companies now have net zero goals.
Yeah, so this is one of the interesting points of alignment with the CHIPS Act. So, increasingly, whether we're talking about semiconductors or footwear, our customers have environmental sustainability and governance goals. And so really, even more so than our own goals that I was talking about earlier, a lot of our customers' goals are even more aggressive in terms of decarbonizing their supply chains and their footprints, their sustainability footprints. And so there is this really interesting intersection between Oregon's competitiveness, our own sort of clean energy economy, and the need for a company in the semiconductor space or the data center space to locate here. And we've seen a lot of that. We're seeing a lot of growth in Oregon's economy as a result.
So why would Portland General create a new position just to focus on this?
Yeah, that was my first question too. So, it's because we want to be a good partner, and we recognize that Maria's got a bazillion different things that she's doing every day. She can't always be in the mix, and so we needed somebody to really jump in at this kind of moment in time. 6 months from now or a year from now, I'm not sure exactly how it will look, but we needed somebody to jump in with the region, and the region is sort of coalescing around this. So there's the task force has really spun out some recommendations, and now there's a group of kind of cross-industry, cross-lobby, the business associations kind of coming together to say, how are we actually going to land some of these dollars? Arizona, New York, Texas, Ohio seem to be ahead of Oregon and starting to garner these investments. I just saw in the news this morning that TSMC out of Taiwan announced a $40 billion fab in Arizona, right? So those investments are happening in other places. Intel making a $20 billion investment in Ohio. And so PGE said, we need to be a good partner, one, and historically we've always been a good partner in economic development. But two, we also, there's a flip side to that coin, which is if if we're successful at bringing some of this investment to Oregon, we also want to be as far upstream as possible in planning for it. So planning for the facilities that might be needed, the energy that might be needed, the right-of-ways, so that we're not a barrier to growth. And that sort of investment, and anytime we're building new facilities, it takes a long time. And we don't want to be the reason that somebody can't come to Oregon and help grow our economy.
So you mentioned the semiconductor task force that was created here. Can you talk a little bit about its genesis and who's on that task force?
Sure. So the genesis, I think, really goes back to probably Senator Wyden, Governor Brown, folks from high tech in Oregon kind of coming together and recognizing that CHIPS was going to happen, and that Oregon wasn't prepared, if I'm just being super blunt about it. And so they kind of built this task force to say, how are we going to rally as a region to capture this? What do we need to do? And how do we sort of have some crisp proposals ready to go? The federal government is poised to start taking action on this in the spring of 2023. So, really the task force this year had to work pretty quickly to develop recommendations that could be actionable for the new governor or for the legislature.
So as I understand it, there are 5 subcommittees that are on the task force. Can you describe what each one is focused on?
Sure. Okay, and remember, I've been at this for a month. So the first...
Wait, you're not an expert already, Andy? Come on.
I could talk energy all day. Semiconductors, coming up to speed. So the first one was incentives. So we already have sort of a framework of incentives in Oregon, and one of the things we want to make sure that happens is that the incentives that are already in place, that those are extended, or that we can kind of build upon those. But additional incentives around things like forgivable loans, workforce incentives, income tax incentives around family wage, investments. So really kind of trying to bolster our incentive framework to be competitive with some of the other states and how those, go ahead.
Oh, do you know some of the states that are more competitive than we are today?
Well, the ones I mentioned earlier are really kind of leading the way. So New York has been super aggressive. They're really making a play for kind of a large center of excellence in New York. Texas, we all know Texas is very aggressive around this. Ohio, Arizona has been as well, right? So those tend to be the names that come up whenever we're talking about this. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Oregon is, and we're preparing for this conversation to happen over the coming months, is that there's things that maybe we wouldn't want about some of those other places. And so one of the other line items or one of the recommendations is how do we get our arms around industrial lands? And that's a touchy topic here in Oregon.
Well, and that's a different subcommittee, right?
It's a different subcommittee. So we had incentives. The university partnerships and higher ed partnerships is a really key one. OSU has been stepping up with some announcements and some concept papers. But how we partner with the university system, and not just OSU and U of O and Portland State, but kind of the whole framework to recognize the various strengths and how we can leverage those to create sort of more of a coordinated higher ed infrastructure around high tech, talent and workforce. So this goes beyond higher ed to think about STEM. How do we partner with Future Ready Oregon, which the governor put, I think it was $200 million in place for Future Ready Oregon this last year.
So the work on that subcommittee actually could help the entire economy of Oregon.
Yeah, totally. So, Oregon forecasts, I think, a shortage of workforce, skilled labor as well, and that's going to like for a company like PGE, that could become a crisis in the sense of how do we have the workforce we need to, and these are high-paying jobs, but to do the work on the lines and generation facilities, and those aren't so different than high tech. 50% of the high tech jobs that you would associate, here in Oregon, actually only require a high school or a community college degree. So we're talking about kind of the same workforce and about giving folks kind of a middle class pathway to a pretty good life.
So you also mentioned land and land use. That's another subcommittee, and what are they finding?
Yeah, so the task force found that that we're just really short on industrial land, buildable industrial land. I think the number that the task force came up with was, I think, 82 acres of available Tier 1, which means buildable industrial land available right now. To put that in perspective, in the 90s, when some of the early work was being done with Intel, I think we made 2,000 acres available for that expansion. And so 80 is not a lot, and won't accommodate a new fab, won't accommodate some of the types of facilities that are being targeted for growth in Oregon. And so that's one of the things I think it's probably the touchiest subject amongst the list of recommendations is how do we partner as a region to do that really thoughtfully so that we don't I think trigger some of the downsides to that, some of the sprawl and the things that Oregon has been really intentional about over the decades.
So what are the recommendations for that committee?
Well, so the recommendations are to basically to find and make available several large parcels of land. Not all of it is in the Portland metro region, but some of it definitely is because that's where the strength of the ecosystem is. And so I think it is about 1,500 acres total of buildable land and making investment possible around that. And so that's going to be, I think, like I said, a big conversation in the coming months.
So we talked about the incentive subcommittee, we talked about the land subcommittee, we talked about the university or the education and talent subcommittee. What are the other two subcommittees?
Talent, industry, environmental. So regulations, permitting, which I think is probably a pretty apt topic for this group. But how do we give? It's not to say that we should be removing regulations. That wasn't really the recommendation of the task force, but it was more so to say Oregon has a strength where we have strong regulations in place, but how do we give companies who are looking to expand or locate in Oregon certainty around timelines and around the rules so they can know how to move through the process to build a new facility. And that was one of the things that was sort of pointed out by the task force is that when, if you go to, let's say, Ohio, and you want to build a new facility, one of the first things they talk about is these are the requirements, this is what you have to do to get through them, this is how long it will take you, so you can have certainty in your project and in your investment as you move forward. And
what's the last subcommittee?
I think we talked about all five.
Did we cover all five?
So.
Okay. So if you had to summarize the key recommendations for the entire task force moving forward, how would you label the top five?
I would call it readiness. Being assertive. I think, when you read the task force report, which you can just kind of Google and read yourself, it's a well-done document. It's really focused at how do we create a space that is really receptive and assertive and ready to go, so that when someone's looking to where are they going to build their next facility or where do they want to do their research, Oregon is a place they can do that. And we have a lot of advantages already. I mean, 15% of the nation's R&D or chip workforce is located in Oregon. 15% of $280 million is $280 billion is $40 billion. So proportionally, from a workforce standpoint, from the big names who are located here, we have a real advantage. And so the task force said, let's make sure that we create a place where a company could actually come and land and see themselves, where they don't have to sort of spend years and years and years trying to figure out how to get here. So
if I'm not mistaken, Hillsboro is one of only 3 locations in the world that actually has significant R&D work being done in the semiconductor space. So we have a huge advantage in this space. But talk about some of the challenges that we're facing as far as recruiting new businesses to come to Oregon.
Yeah, so, the challenges this is going to sound a little bit like I'm repeating myself, but I mean, one of the big ones that has to be mentioned is the industrial land availability, and I think that one might be a pretty critical barrier over the next 6 months or so as the federal government starts to give away dollars or award dollars. If companies literally can't find a place to locate, Oregon won't be one of those places. So that's one. And then I had thought about another one. That was the biggest one on my list. Let me just give me a second. Yeah.
Well, these federal programs really have the potential to bring a lot of investment dollars into our state. Are there any other opportunities for the region related to these programs, and whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or the Infrastructure and Jobs Act?
Sure. Yeah. So it's just such an interesting time. Talked to somebody recently, and they said it's almost like it's just raining money right now out of the just so much money has been put into these different acts from the federal government, and I guess I'll say from a PGE standpoint, CHIPS is one, right? So we want to be supportive there, but we're also really heavily leaning into the other two, the IIJA and the IRA, and what we're looking at there is how can we use dollars there to help accelerate infrastructure investments, to continue modernizing our system, which is really important to companies who want to locate here, that we have a modern, highly reliable electrical grid. How do we deal with some of the other things the region is facing, like wildfires? It's a really critical one right now. Transportation electrification. So, we're really looking at how do we take advantage of these dollars, really for the benefit of our customers, so that we can keep prices low, accelerate this path to 2030 and 2040. And in doing so, I think create a great place for companies to do business, for our customers, to achieve the things that they want to achieve.
So how is Oregon doing so far in gaining some of these federal dollars?
Well, so far, not a lot of dollars have been awarded. So I would say we're kind of at the starting line for a lot of this. December 16, PGE has a couple of concepts that we're putting in, or applications we're putting into the IIJA and the IRA. So that's coming right up, and we think that we're competitive there. Like I said, the Department of Commerce in the spring will start awarding dollars around the CHIPS Act. And again, the task force is trying to send the message, working with the legislature and the governor, that Oregon wants to be part of that. So we'll see how we do. Obviously, news like TSMC's this morning tells us we've got a ways to go, and we've missed a couple of big investments like that. So we'll see how we do, but we don't have to win it all, but we want to be competitive, and we want to bring Oregon share to Oregon.
Now, you mentioned some of the other areas that some of this the funding is going towards, some of the other industries. Can you talk a little bit about whether it's energy storage or hydrogen, or is PG, Portland General, getting involved in any of those initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So, energy storage is, when you think about what we were discussing earlier, when you start to base your electricity supply on renewables, your supply inherently becomes variable, right? We don't control when the sun shines or when the wind blows. And so, the problem of the sort of energy system in the future is not so much, where do we find all the energy, but it's really how do we make sure the energy is available at the right time. And so energy storage and I think hydrogen are going to play a really critical role in the future, because those, we can put energy into a battery, into a car. We can use excess wind to generate clean hydrogen and store it for times when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun isn't shining, but we still need to serve customers. We need a reliable grid. And so there's some pretty big proposals being considered right now for the region. Concepts like a hydrogen hub. We're looking to deploy a large amount of storage on our system. We have some, actually, when we talk about innovation and about ecosystems, Portland, I'd say sort of in Oregon, I shouldn't just say Portland, but Oregon kind of punches above its weight with some early stage or successful now storage companies based here. And so we've really leaned into that, and we're hopeful that that these dollars coming from the federal government really help accelerate some of those solutions so they become, again, cost effective for our customers. Because the flip side of all of this is we want to keep prices as low as possible, reduce the burden on our customers.
So what's next for the task force, for Portland General, for you as it relates to all these initiatives?
Sure. So, for the task force, we're really gearing up for the legislative session and for working with the new governor's administration, really trying to figure out how to sort of partner as a region to put some of these recommendations into place. And so that, I think, that will define really probably the next 6 months worth of work. There's also proposals that will be submitted to the federal government. So coming out of the semiconductor space, out of higher education, if we can land a major sort of focus area here in Oregon, some of those initial proposals will happen in the next couple months. So we want to support that. And then on top of all that work, PGE, coming out of House Bill 2021 last year, in the next 6 months, we'll file our first ever clean energy plan, and then what we call an integrated resource plan that supports that says, here's how we think we're going to meet those targets. Here's how we're working with communities and with customers to get there. This is what we think it'll mean to costs. And so really sort of painting that future picture of how we're going to achieve these goals. And so it's going to be a really busy time.
Well, you mentioned the next legislative session, and it reminds me that there are a fair number of new legislators, and there's also a fairly new governor.
That's right.
And with all of those folks that are brand new really in role, what role is Portland General taking in helping them get up to speed so they can be that much more effective for us?
Sure. So, I think for us, part of our role to play goes back to how we're being supportive, right? We're not a chip manufacturer, but I think we can, really start to help the region understand this intersection between the clean energy economy and a high-tech economy. Why there's sort of a circular flywheel there that's beneficial, whether it's around the workforce, around prosperity for the region. What is our role in helping to support that? What is the region going to need to do to help us help support that? And kind of painting this picture that kind of this rising economy is really good. And some of the questions we get asked are like, well, will there be enough energy? Can the grid handle it? And so part of our job is just to help explain that, help explain all the things we're doing so that we're not a barrier. One, and then I think through Maria's leadership, just being a voice again of support, helping kind of carry the message forward, so to speak. So from a PGE standpoint, we're really a supporter, and that's that's our job across lots of different areas.
So are there any other business initiatives that Portland General is taking on that will also help our environment and possibly also help our economy?
Sure. Well, so from a help our economy standpoint, we've already been very, very invested in workforce. We see it whether or not CHIPS Act and semiconductors was happening. This is a critical area of investment for us. So we're all in on future ready. And really trying to make sure that Oregon has the workforce it needs. And of course, we benefit from that by ensuring that we have the workforce that we need. So that one's really, really important. I think the other thing, I kind of go back to right now, I think our focus is in some ways narrowing in on the goals that we have around clean energy. And so, one of the ways that that sort of plays itself out is we've realized that in order to meet our goals, we're going to need all the participation we can get. So all the facilities that we can build, but we're really going to need our customers to show up and interact with energy in a different way. And that was, before this job, that was really my last job, is thinking about customer programs. And by 2030, 2040, we estimate that something like 25% of the flexibility of our system will come from customers themselves. So whether that's from a car or from a thermostat, from a building that's interacting with the grid. And so a lot of our work over the last year or two has been sort of reshaping how we engage around that and really leaning into communities, how communities have a voice at the table, how they can help us plan the system, how we can invest in their facilities. And so for me, that'll be actually the next part of my job, is working with the community-based renewable energy work that's happening in Oregon, and how we can really help jumpstart some of these community projects. And we see that as a two-way benefit: investment in community, jobs in the community, but really local resources for the grid. So those would be two big ways that I think we're making headway and big investments in our local economy.
Do you have any examples of some specific communities where you've started to have some of this positive engagement already?
Well, yeah, it's pretty impressive. So when something as nerdy as the distribution system planning that we do, highly technical, engineering focused. When we open up our distribution system planning process to stakeholders, we have something like 70 to 100 different groups register and participate in that process. And so it goes way beyond any one community. It's pretty robust, the ways that the communities are engaging. We've done a couple microgrids recently to kind of demonstrate what that can look like with Beaverton Public Safety Center and the Anderson Readiness Center. But I expect you'll start to see some of those move into more community projects, less public infrastructure projects.
Well, Andy, thank you for answering all of my questions. We still have some time, so if there are any questions from anyone here at the luncheon, we'd love to take them from you.
I've got a microphone here too I can bring to you.
It's hard to see. Over here.
Okay, great.
First off, really appreciate your time and explaining everything, how you're walking through. My question is for education, especially for CHIPS. You've been talking a lot about needing the infrastructure, needing the locations to draw on the businesses. What about education, and how is that being addressed?
Good question. So two of the task force recommendations were focused, I would say, on education areas. One was sort of higher ed, and so that was focused on a couple of different, I guess, sort of sub-recommendations. So, first, really sort of trying to coalesce the way that our different educational institutions in Oregon partner together. How one of the recommendations is just pretty significant investment in kind of research focus to help elevate our research institutions here around higher ed, and to make this really a premier kind of education place. As well as recently, for example, Oregon State has made a couple sort of big announcements about some of the work that they want to do, whether it's a new facility or some new partnerships in higher ed. But that's higher ed, and so that only gets at advanced degrees and having sort of the right research and engineering workforce available. The other part of the education recommendations was really around, again, sort of leaning into future-ready Oregon and STEM funding and investment in Oregon, so that as folks are coming through high school, that they're really getting sort of ready for, and they're aware of careers in this area. Like I said, roughly, I think it's just under 50% of the projected workforce needed to support the high-tech manufacturing space and semiconductor space in Oregon. 50% of that workforce is projected to be essentially high school graduate or community college certificate education. And so by investing in STEM and by investing in Future Ready, we can really get at helping folks be aware of these careers and being ready to plug into some of these jobs that are really good jobs. They pay disproportionately higher than a typical high school diploma or community college diploma job would. So it's a really great opportunity to sort of to start building again sort of middle class pathways, and you do that through kind of these two different levels: higher ed and then Future Ready Oregon, and supporting some of the STEM work that's going on right now. Does that help?
Dave.
Maybe you could just repeat the question.
Yeah,
Sure.
we could do that.
It's on the way.
She's right behind you.
I didn't think you were going to be allowed to ask questions, Dave.
Yeah, Greg was trying to dive in front and grab the mic away from me, but I fended him off. So talk a little bit, Andy, I'm really interested in how PG is thinking. You mentioned in your talk that you don't want PG to be a barrier to semiconductor manufacturing, but I think this is a room full of folks who work on permitting a lot of times and compliance issues. As you think about a lot of this would sort of turn on something like building ahead of need. Do you build sizing the substations or building the electric system at a site or multiple sites? How are you guys thinking about that as you think about planning and working with the Utility Commission, who doesn't necessarily want you spending money willy-nilly that's never going to get used, but how do you get ready for these big investments so that you're not the barrier?
Yeah. Good question, Dave. So that's actually really timely. So, I mentioned earlier that I think probably most states that you go to, the utility is a economic development partner in the state. And the reason is exactly as Dave mentioned, is because if you can't serve power to a facility, no one's going to build that facility. And so, one of the things that I've been spending the last month thinking about and worrying about is when you look at the projected growth in Oregon, it's a lot. We have a lot of growth happening here because of investments that have been made over the decades, because we have clean energy, because we have a direct, T5 cable to Asia, and then sort of the ecosystem begets the ecosystem. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about and talking about, and I mentioned like our integrated resource plan. Well, this integrated resource plan, we've been talking about how do we tell the region, how do we tell our stakeholders, the Public Utility Commission, what's at stake if we don't start building ahead, if we don't start leaning into some of this projected growth. And historically, or not historically, today the way it works is if we make an investment, say, in a new substation for a company who's locating in Oregon, the commission will look at that and say, well, was that prudent or was that imprudent? Was that a good investment on behalf of customers? Should customers help pay for that investment? And so we really walk this line of prudency very carefully, because the last thing we want is for those investments to be disallowed. That's the technical term for it. And so, what the commission is in place to do is to protect customers from risk. They sort of act as a, on behalf of customers, to protect customers from risk. And so what we're seeing is, as a region, there's risk in not acting as well. And so we're really trying to start forecasting, where are we going to need, new substations, new transmission lines, and why do we need to be making these investments now, even before maybe somebody has located their facility? What does that mean? And so I think as a company, we're seeing the need to be more assertive around that, lest we fall behind, or lest we, lest we become the reason that somebody can't locate here. And so it's a really interesting topic because I think it starts to shift the posture of the commission and of ourselves as we try to, support the state. And I think the last thing any of us want, whether the commission or ourselves, is to be in the way of that. So it's tricky. The last thing we want to do too is build a substation that nobody's using. And so part of my job is, and part of the reason that PGE is invested so early in this process is to be able to say, where do we think the growth is going to happen? How certain do we think it is? And as quickly as possible, bring that information back and put it into our forecasts, give it to our transmission planners and say, okay, we've got the capacity, or, oh, we're going to need to expand that substation, and to kind of get on that as quickly as possible.
Well, Andy, thank you for spending some time sharing all this with everyone. I know that you're still new in your role and have a lot you're still getting up to speed on, but you did a fantastic job of really explaining a lot of what we're going through in this state. So this is a great time for Oregon and a real opportunity for us. So hopefully we take advantage of it. So thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks for doing this with me.